Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to the 16th episode of Quarantine. We have been at this for 8 weeks, and it is really 8 weeks that has changed a lot of the landscape of our economy and how we look at the world. And we're now going to get into that. You know, one of the early themes of this show was immediate response versus long-term planning. On our very second episode, John Clippinger talked about imagining and planning for a post-COVID world. How might that create a unique moment when convention was off the table and we could apply more imagination and really previously unimaginable thinking to our future? But then just a few seconds later on that same show, Dale Doherty came back and said, wait, this is an emergency. There are PPEs to be made that aren't being made, human talent that needs to be connected up and solve our greatest problems right now. And so that theme, how do you manage in real time when every assumption is changing and when also you're planning for a very different future than today? How do you manage both for the short term and for the long term? Turns out to be a very big issue. And that's something we want to dive into here as we turn to leadership. Who do we trust? Who among our leaders can at once be operational, but also manage for these suddenly remote workforces and then prepare for success in a tomorrow, which by definition really can't be predicted. So today, we're really thrilled to turn to kind of a deep bench among our colleagues and friends at BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. My co-host, Mickey McManus, is a fellow at BCG, and joining us today also is Martin Reeves, who leads their Henderson Institute. It's really the internal think tank that BCG uses to inspire leadership ideas and approaches to prepare our largest enterprises and governments for tomorrow. And Martin has been an innovator in adaptive systems-oriented leadership for years, and he has spent the last couple of months really Zoom to Zoom with global executives listening, advising, forming observations, and today he can share with us both approaches and a report card, if you will, on how our enterprises are or are not preparing for tomorrow. And also in today's show, we're going to turn to Eliza Heinrich. She's a 2020 grad of the Minerva Intentional University, and they bring a very radical approach to management, employing systems thinking and really a generational approach to income inequality. I think this may be a view into what leadership might well evolve into for the next half a century or so. Hey, Mick, welcome to the show. And why don't you start kicking us off? Because our guest today is also a colleague of yours at BCG.
You bet. So yeah, I'm a senior advisor there, and Martin, from the minute I even learned about BCG, has been sort of a guiding light. It's been fascinating to hear because he steps back and he is the chairman of the Bruce Henderson Institute. It's named after the founder. It was instantiated at the 100th birthday of the founder, and they really are a strategy laboratory, and think deeply about the future of leadership and the future of strategy. So I wanted to make a note, Omid, I don't know if you could bring up the whiteboard for a second. For any of those that are online, we do have an infinite whiteboard here, and we've been tracking every single show. So if you want to come on and add your Post-it notes or add your thoughts, you can just go to our quarantine.today site, click on the Miro link, and you can zoom in and kind of add things. I've left space for you to doodle to the right of me so I can keep drawing and you can add things. If you don't feel like it, it's okay too. This is just sort of an experiment in creating a time machine at this moment. And I'm super excited to have Elisa as well. I've been following Minerva since they started about 6 years ago, and just understanding this new kind of a university that has system thinking at its core, and that people from all around the world are recruited in, and then they're actually sent all over the world over 4 years. So they spend a semester in a different country, in a different town, working with a different city, looking at different challenges every single semester after their first year. So they're really almost living in the times that we're feeling right now. They're living in very tumultuous, ambiguous times over 4 years and trying to form their own identity. So it'll be exciting to see the two. Let's bring Martin in. And Martin, can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you're seeing at the front lines? What's happening Zoom to
Yes,
Zoom?
I'm Martin Reeves. I'm a 30-year veteran business strategist, and I lead BCG's research on strategy, having formerly had an illustrative career as a failed biologist and then a failed musician, but found my mark in strategy. And I've been focused in the last weeks on mobilizing our research resources to help leaders make sense of and manage the opportunity and the threat in the COVID crisis. So I think from many Zoom calls, the pattern that I'm seeing is that businesses understand that we have a pretty complex problem to solve here, and everything connected to everything problem. We have a whole systems disturbance at the level of society, economy, companies, health, you name it. And we're doing that under uncertainty. We don't actually know precisely what the problem is. We're learning more every day. Yet we have to take rapid pragmatic action. And to further complicate matters, we actually have an inability to forecast. The economic models on which forecasts are based are calibrated on quarterly GDP adjustments of 5 to 7%. And we're seeing 25 to 30 on a quarter-to-quarter basis annualized. So really, we're outside the range of the calibration of the models. But we can say that really this crisis, however long it lasts, will be consisting of a number of phases that represent different problems to leaders. So first, we have a problem of pragmatic action, which I call the reaction phase. We have to do something to keep people safe, something to preserve supply chain integrity, and so on. And then we have a somewhat plannable problem, namely preparing for a recession. We can control costs. We can control cash flow to some extent. We can't control revenues because that's demand, that's the economy. But we can take planned cost reduction and cost prudence measures. Then we have what I call an adaptive problem. Namely, there is a strong possibility of recurrence of the disease. We don't know when, we don't know if, we don't know how much, but historical precedent in Singapore and Hong Kong suggests there's a possibility. And then we have a creative problem, which is when demand rebounds, as it eventually will, we won't go exactly back to normal, but judging by previous wars and social disruptions and pandemics, reality will be altered in some way. So we need to be adapting to the unknown. So we need to deploy our creativity there. So actually, leaders need to look ahead. They need to think about multiple timescales. They need to react more rapidly than their organizations can. They need to act under imperfect information, and they need to actually tap into their cognitive diversity of their organizations to solve these very different types of problem. An adjustment problem is different from an adaptation problem, is different from a creativity problem. So that's sort of my sense of the size of the problem. And of course, in business, it's not whether you're thinking about these things, it's whether you're thinking about these things sufficiently and more sufficiently than your competitors. So we have that gaming aspect too. I mean, it may seem a little bit inappropriate to think about this humanitarian crisis in terms of winners and losers right now, but every economic or social crisis ends up as a strategic opportunity. Some companies do win and some do lose. So it eventually becomes competitive, and it's my job to think about that too.
You've laid out a remarkable landscape of the kind of challenges. And of course, just behind it are a bunch of strategies of how to deal with that. And they're probably giving us a lens into a lot of management in an adaptive future. Before we get to that, I'd love to hear something of a report card. You've spent the last couple of months talking to a couple hundred business leaders. How are they doing? What kind of, class or grades do you put them into? Like, what defines what's working and what worries you?
Well, the pattern that I see is one that I've seen often, which is when I look at, there are discontinuities, different types of discontinuities. Sometimes a discontinuity created by an innovation. And what one might reasonably expect to find is that some companies are adopting the new jet engine business model and others are not. But actually, what I'm not finding is a sort of presence and absence pattern. In other words, these guys are thinking about something and these guys are not. It's more an issue of sufficiency and speed. So if I take the that the end of that spectrum of problems that I was talking about, the creative problems, the ones of reimagining and reinventing the business, I don't think there's a business out there that doesn't realize that they need to reimagine their business. I think there's a lot of businesses, and we can quantify this because we've actually surveyed hundreds of large companies. There are a lot of companies that are thinking about doing that, setting up a task force. They may have had an executive committee discussion, but there are other companies that are actually looking at anomalies, going and doing deep discovery with customers, looking at new needs, stretching their mental models. There are other companies that have really, with this word sufficiency, they've gone much deeper on that problem. So already, actually, the problem is competitive. Already there's a major competitive divergence. Some are doing extraordinarily well and have reinvented their business. I'll give you a couple of examples of very creative moves we've seen in China that is, of course, 6 weeks ahead of us. And other companies are really more coping with the scary sort of cash flow type issues, which are right in front of their noses.
Yeah, you pointed out in one of your writings that historically it's in downturns that companies can exceed themselves. And you mentioned that Apple kind of in an unlikely manner introduced the iPod in the middle of the downturn in 2001 when, sales of everything were down, but they kind of got to exceed themselves then. And, I've just noticed, like, in the last week, at the moment when suddenly the food supply chain is challenged and beef is both maybe a cause of pandemics and it's also a cause of climate change, you've seen the plant-based food people lowering prices and leaning in, taking advantage. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yes, indeed. So I've been fascinated since about the age of 8 by paradoxes. And so I like very much I think it's Warren Buffett says, and I'm not sure whether he originated it. He says, be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy, be psychologically counter-cyclical. And I think there's something going on here in recessions. So we might not associate recessions with creativity and with growth, and for good reason, because on average, recessions harm company growth and value generation. The average company reduces costs to match declining demand. They don't do so sufficiently to cover for declining demand. They cut costs, they damage their capacity for growth, and they end up not growing, not only during the recession, but they damage their capacity for growth beyond the recession. Now, economists might be interested in averages and aggregates, but strategists are interested in exceptions to trends and anomalies. They want to be the exception to the trend. And it's a very good time for exceptions. So what I call competitive volatility, which is the amount of competitive jiggling around. How often does number 2 become number 1 or number 2 become number 4? That's competitive volatility. Competitive volatility is highest in recessions and downturns. So you could put it this way: when your competitors are least likely to be thinking about growth because they're preoccupied with survival, think about growth. And so differential growth is something that's available in recessions. So really the two primitive strategies of a recession, and we are probably already in the middle of a recession. Of course, we don't call a recession until we've had 2 quarters of negative economic growth, and then the economic reporting delay. So by the time it's reported, you've probably almost finished it, but we're probably already in a recession. A very bad strategy is no strategy, which is just carry on as normal. We'll make it up as we go along. A not great strategy is to have a defensive policy, which is, well, I'm going to cut to survive, but not to think about flourishing, not to think about rebound. An okay strategy is also to think about rebound. I'm going to cut, but I'm going to reinvest a little bit. And a good strategy is actually to think defensively and aggressively, but to get the balance right for every particular business you face. There'll be some businesses that have weak balance sheets or weak competitive positions, which you need to get out of. That needs to become prey. And there are probably other businesses where you have very strong balance sheets, and it's a great time for consolidation. You should probably be out there acquiring very, very aggressively. But it's very important to pivot to growth. Now, companies get there eventually, but I always find as a strategist, business is a pretty interesting game. It's not coming up with the right answer. It's coming up with a good enough answer faster than your competitors. So basically, before we have definitive proof of opportunity, we must have an opportunity mindset. And this all traces back to the theme of today, leadership, because one of the key determinants of whether we have an abundance mindset or not is the words of leaders. if leaders are broadcasting pessimistic beliefs, let's be very careful. Let's only think about cash flow preservation. It's probably going to be really bad. If there are any statisticians out there, essentially they're broadcasting pessimistic, self-fulfilling Bayesian priors. They're essentially sowing the seeds of other people's pessimism. So really, not naive thinking, but expansive thinking on the part of leaders is absolutely essential. So I think crisis leadership is a very valuable thing.
For those of us who are in the West Coast innovation community, this looks like a fundamental kind of phase change in the economy, because so much of consumer preference appears to be changing in the sense that, and second order effects, right? Are we going to want to go back to downtown office space? Are we going to be reinvesting in stuff from home, in our homes more? Which does the restaurant industry completely change? Which means if you're a leader, you're not just trying to lead and manage, but kind of all of this whole new world that we've been talking about that may be more resilient, more local, adaptive, all these things. Suddenly that future that was maybe the 2040 future we talked about might be the 2022 future. Okay, well, that's us West Coast types talking, but I mean, how do people that are actually dealing with, tens of thousands of employees in global enterprises deal with that?
Well, and I think, Martin, you mentioned that you had a few examples from China or other places that are sort of positive examples of sort of taking advantage of this moment or trying to think differently. I'd also like to hear about that.
Yes, I'm an incurable conceptualizer, so let me give you a conceptual answer and then give you some specifics. But so I, some of the conversations I find myself in with leaders are, number one, don't only ask passive questions, because it's very easy in a crisis to say what's going to happen, how long is it going to last, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my sector. Well, these are good questions for historians and economists, people that are interested in the macro picture. But a CEO should be interested in their particular enterprise. Even if it's the only enterprise flourishing in their sector, they should be figuring out exactly how that's going to happen. So, ask how you can shape things, what you can shape, how you can be exceptional, how you are exceptional. I think a second pattern is de-averaging, which is don't take the general answer. Don't say generally companies are going to lose. Generally companies are going to lose in my sector. Look at the specifics. What can we specifically do given our opportunities, our customers, our balance sheet, and so on. And the other one is observe, which is that which you assume to be the case. Reality, when business people batter around words like practicality and reality and realism and pragmatism, what they're actually talking about is their mental models. And, in a sense, a very conservative mental model is as arbitrary as a very pie in the sky mental model. And the important thing to calibrate those mental models is to look. And there's a lot which is changing right now. So, a more specific answer to your question, there are very creative things going on in China, and everyone should be looking very carefully at China because they're 6 weeks, 8 weeks ahead of us. And so I see things like the spontaneous emergence of supply chain coordination, ecosystems based upon social media platforms, orchestrated by the least likely mid-sized players. I see those are very interesting things like that. I see adaptations of some of the businesses which have been hit most extremely. So, for example, restaurant chain businesses that are concluded, look, there is no demand. We have to change the model and we have to reallocate people. So I've seen them reallocating people's time to creative activities. I've seen them lending employees, with formal arrangements to employees that are trying to hire people, the delivery services. I've seen them having meal kit, moving to a meal kit business model. Where they go outside the store and they sell meal kits so people can eat restaurant-style food in their homes. And it's fascinating to see the zoo of emerging business models, because among them, is the William Gibson future that is unevenly distributed. Nothing that's going on is a guarantee. China is different. Things may not work. In fact, one of the toughest analytical problems is to look at charts like the one we see here, and filter out the temporary changes from the permanent changes. So there are there's lots of ephemera. So, I very much, if you challenge me to think about a logic, it might make an interesting interview question. why would a viral pandemic increase the consumption of toilet paper or groceries on an ongoing basis? It probably doesn't. You could probably come up with some contorted logic that it would, but it has to be an intertemporal demand shift, either a hoarding or a postponement. And that's most of what you see. So the wrong conclusion is, oh, grocers are doing really well, let's get into the grocery business. I think there are some techniques which people don't have to deploy in peacetime in market research, which are designed to tease apart the temporary from the permanent. So, for example, you can look at relaxation constants. You can say, well, buying groceries from this channel or this channel is a sort of a behavior, and we've had a shift in this direction. But how fast is it reverting? Is it reverting at all? And you can get like a measure of elasticity or permanence of behaviors. Another technique is you can look at where the smart money is going. I mean, right now, a lot of venture money is being held in cash. Investments are being postponed, but still there are some bargain hunting, some investments. So where's the smart money going? That's a signal that at least a certain set of people that are very thoughtful about these things have decided that this signal is important, this signal is less important. You can look at multi-timescale strategy. It's interesting. A lot of the things that we assumed were later problems are now problems. Yeah. So we have a rare opportunity to see the long term and the short term converge, which means that we can ask questions like, well, is this short term behavior I'm seeing the acceleration of a long term trend, in which case you could make a reasonable bet that it will persist and accelerate, or is it the reversal, in which case it would have to be damn powerful to change the course of history? It's probably just a temporary reversal. So some companies have, so coming back to your question, Peter, some companies are deploying incredible sophistication in getting to the bottom of these weak signals and doing so well ahead of the competitors. And others are just, talking about it at a more sort of, casual, informal level, and guess who's going to win.
I'm curious.
Slide with us.
I
just
ahead,
wanted to put up another slide here.
Yeah.
You put up a slide that showed that there were kind of 5 approaches to this, which is basically there's like what you've normally been doing when things aren't changing quickly and they're predictable. And then you've got these 2 axes of how you begin to go into a world that's less predictable. And I found this fascinating because, there seems to be a paradox between planning and unpredictability, but that's exactly where we're at.
Right. So this is from a book I wrote a few years ago that, to be honest, at the time was of interest to certain, career strategists, but was probably not of wide interest. But now seems accidentally extraordinarily relevant, which is the idea that people talk about strategy and they often conflate it with planning. They see strategy as the strategic planning process. Well, in truth, classical strategic planning, analyzing, making a forecast, making a plan, and sticking to the plan, which is durable across multiple years or time periods. That's one way of doing strategy. That's good for relatively unshapable, relatively predictable situations. If you're in a very unpredictable situation that's not shapeable, your best bet is probably to adapt faster than your competitors. Everything I'm talking about here is a competitive game. So if, for example, the rebound of the disease, adapting to that, it may happen, but it's not predictable. The epidemiologists can't agree on when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. But you can be advantaged by being prepared for the possibility and rolling out that possibility rapidly and not having huge organizational inertia. Then, of course, we have the other side of the chart, which is the creative side of strategy, which is if we can shape, if the environment is malleable. And the environment is malleable if it's embryonic, if it's a new thing, then an entrepreneur can shape that possibility in the world. If they are, if they're powerful, if they have proprietary knowledge, if they're very daring, if they have great influence. And the creative side of the strategy chart is basically precisely reimagining the future, reimagining and shaping the future, either individually, visionary strategy, or collaboratively, which is platform or ecosystem.
I like, that feels like that ties back into your comment about don't ask passive questions. Like the idea that you actually are a leader. You can take action. Your company can do something. Or wherever you are, and being more about how could I shape this right now, is more about agency versus sort of self-doubt, which is the sort of pessimism,
may
self-fulfillment.
be a paradoxical statement to some, because you may
Hmm.
say, don't we have less agency than average under extreme conditions? Well, in one sense, yes, we have more constraints. But the constraints will be something that will be wreaking havoc with your competitors. So you have the malleability of the caused by the incapacitation of your competitors. Also, we know just empirically from business history that you're more likely to leapfrog your competition during bad times than good times. So so that is shapeable. Also, there are probably times when, you know, a great debater, as putting on my greatly qualified hat as a failed musician, one of the great debates in music is, do you really need a conductor? Is the conductor just, you know, making beautiful movements in front of the orchestra? And there are probably times when a great orchestra doesn't need a conductor. You know, like during the actual performance, probably things are, you know, probably would have been great anyway. But you probably need it if you're trying something new. You probably need it if you're not aligned. You don't have, you know, hundreds of years of cumulative shared experience together. You probably need it during rehearsal. And right now, if you say, well, can organizations automatically run themselves? I don't think so. On average, an organization in a crisis becomes very introverted, becomes very fearful, becomes very conservative, and contracts its spatial and temporal horizons. So who can change that? Well, a leader, actually. You know, so there's an extraordinary time when leadership is the thing which sets the tone. The difference between the fearful company focused on, you know, with a very sharp pencil on cash flow and one that's reimagining the future is probably a much greater difference than the difference between great companies in peacetime.
Well, you know, this actually reminds me, Martin, of you mentioned that you're working on a new book, a new thesis, to sort of think about leadership in the mind, you know, sort of personal leadership, and how do we then actually enable that synchronization to happen? You know, because if we pull in too much and we're very passive, we're not synchronizing with our own culture, with our own team. We're not sharing the epic story so that people want to join the journey. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the thinking you're having right now about this book you're coming out with, and creativity itself, or imagination, I guess. Yeah.
So prompted by the right-hand side of the chart you just showed, the creative side of strategy, I'm quite fascinated by the words that business is comfortable using and the words that it uses less often. So, you know, about half of the English language, which you'll never find in an annual report. So you're unlikely to find the word love or passion or compassion in a business report, and that's a whole different story. You know, where's the humanity in business? But also you'll find less words which are to do with imagination, creativity. You find a little bit of that, but it's not really, you know, mainstream big business thinking. So I've written a book. The title is still provisional. I finished the book, but it hasn't been published yet. Which is probably going to be called something like Competing on Imagination, which is about challenging the notion that you know, business, that imagination is like a frivolous luxury for big businesses, especially in bad times. Challenging the idea that that imagination is some sort of magical force that can't be harnessed. Challenging the idea that it's an instantaneous event in the minds of a small number of genius individuals. And actually, so the thesis is essentially that nothing new or valuable in business was ever initially created without imagination. We may forget that because most of us are working for big companies who are rehearsing and refining the messy recipe that the entrepreneur created 100 years ago or 50 years ago. But actually, it was always messy at the beginning. So that's thesis number one, which is that's where the value comes from. You know, thesis number two is with the declining longevity of competitive advantage and leadership because of the tremendous sort of churn in the world because of many factors, but technological evolution being one of them, that big businesses cannot just coast on the last decades or the last millennium's business model. They need to reinvent themselves. So it's not the business of entrepreneurs, it's the business of big business also to reinvent itself.
So I want to stop you there for 1 second, because I think, you know, I remember watching a presentation of yours that you were giving, and you showed how volatile it's actually become in just the last decade through a large-scale study of sort of how quickly people are being kind of bumped off their top perch and moving down. So there's sort of background behind this. The longevity of sort of resting on your laurels is getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it used to be the case that when you see the grand architecture of a bank, the fake Grecian columns and so on, you may think, well, this building is 100 years old. Our institutions will last longer than the humans who work in those institutions. And in business, that was true until a couple of decades ago, when we started to see human longevity increasing and business longevity decreasing, and they've actually now crossed over. So the average expected lifespan of a public company in the US today is 37 years, whereas, of course, the average human being can expect to live into their 70s or 80s. So the impermanence of business is a new thing. So that leads on to this logic that we need to renew. We can't merely coast on. We can't merely coast and defend. And then the main thesis of the book is that this is a shapeable, somewhat manageable process. And I talk about 6 steps very briefly. The first one is having a reason to imagine. The common word for that is inspiration. Where does inspiration comes from? Inspiration comes from anomalies and accidents and analogies. The human brain is very good at pattern mismatch, pattern perception, and pattern mismatch perception. So we notice this new piece of data doesn't quite fit. So what does fit then? So this is the trigger for the imagination. And large organizations, of course, just arithmetically, think about an organization as a ball. As the radius of the ball increases, the ratio of the surface area to the volume declines. More and more of the activity becomes internally facing. So you're less likely to see the anomaly unless you take special efforts. The second step is rethinking the mental model. So in business, we often use words like industry, market share, thinking that we're talking about reality, some objective construct, whereas in fact we're talking about a mental model. I can think that I of myself as being a consultant. I can think about myself as being a failed musician. I can think about myself as being in the business services industry. I can think about myself as a fanatical missionary of new age ideas. There are any number of ways of conceiving of what one does, and so there's a whole discipline around counterfactual thinking, which is thinking about things that are not the case but could be the case. And some companies train themselves to do that and have procedures for that, and others don't. The third step is collision with reality, acting. The thing between a private delusion or a private indulgence and over a cup of coffee and a harnessed idea is that action is taken in the world. And there are various types of action we can take. We can talk to people, we can shift our focus, we can update our mental models. So it's about the discipline of what sort of action based upon the idea. I also call that crossing the air gap. Ideas have to cross the gap between the brain and reality in order to do any real work.
It feels like that's just for a second, Martin, this idea of taking action. A lot of people are like, oh, I thought of that 5 years ago. I thought of that 30 years ago. But then they never took action, right? And often the act of taking the action, we used to call it at Maya, create a deliverable for action instead of a deliverable for archiving. So make something really wrong, but make something, because then your customer will tear it apart and show you what you really want. And it's that kind of almost riffing by using the act of making as a creative process, a dialogue that you enter into with the physical world to actually poke around at this thing and find out what really matters.
Another important point is it's not testing. Testing trivializes what's going on. It is a dialogue between the superior brain of reality, the implicit intelligence of the complexity and dynamism of reality versus my deductive capabilities as a human being. Is a vast difference, and therefore by interacting, I enrich my thinking.
So you were listing 6 of these. I want to hear the rest. Yeah, I'm trying to capture them all as fast as I can.
The fourth one is socialization, which brings us back nicely to the topic of leadership. So, you could, if you were a physicalist, let's say, if you a materialist, you're only interested in the material artifacts of business, you could make a statement like, without capital allocation, ideas don't grow. But this is a very dry description of what's going on. You could equally say, well, people's brains are part of the reality that needs to be altered, because without social adoption and sympathy and empathy, if I have a new widget and you don't agree with me that it's a new thing, or you call it something else, or you're not inspired by my widget, nothing is going to happen. There's a whole sort of brain to brain evolution and transfer that's going on. So the social amplification of ideas is very important. And some companies think a lot about that. Others almost deliberately create functional silos which prevent that communication from occurring. The fifth stage is almost may sound like the opposite of imagination, which is routinization, which is to create the procedures or the standard operating procedures which harness the innovation in a reproducible form. But if you think about it, there's no limit to what one could describe. The words that one could use to create the Borges map of this video conference could exceed the number of words in the video conference, right? I could talk about the interesting shade of blue of your shirt and the way the light's falling on it and the crease on the left, and there could be an infinite regress of detail. What is the relevant detail? There's an act of insight and communication and strategic empathy in terms of defining what are the essential features that create both reproducibility and evolvability. Because if you give employees or the next generation such a straitjacket instruction set that there's no wiggle room, essentially have a very limited lifespan for that invention. And then the last one, which is quite difficult, is institutionalization of imagination, which is the ability to do it more than once, to be an encore company. So many companies, more companies fail than succeed, at the startup stage. But of the ones that survive their first year, many do well, and doing well once is not so unusual. But doing well once and then doing well with a different product generation or a different business model or after a crisis, what I call an encore company, is extraordinarily rare. And that's a tricky thing, because you've actually got to balance another one of these paradoxes that I love, which is you've got to have the business-like discipline of attention to detail, rigorous execution, and all of that stuff. At the same time that you've got to have skepticism, creativity, playfulness, adaptiveness, cognitive diversity, and you've got to live the paradox and get that, and constantly be rebalancing both sides of that paradox, which is again a key role for a leader, because no organization will automatically do that. I think Steve Jobs said, I can't remember his exact quote, but I'm not fond of attributing all wisdom to Steve Jobs, but he did say a few really wise things. Well, he said, a company is dying when it starts to be run by the I think he said like the marketing people. I mean, essentially he meant when the first-hand experience of the engineers, the people that are worrying about the next new thing, becomes the routinization of selling the thing, and that becomes the major focus. You've got a company focused on exploitation and no longer one focused on exploration. And that was a danger that some companies worry about a lot, and some companies don't worry about at all. So that's a huge, also
I like that.
competitive divergence and a leadership divergence.
Martin, you began this riff and your new book on this notion that story and the words matter, right? How we language this matters. And that strikes me as particularly apt right now, because we're in this crisis, which is a downer, and the simple reading of it is the economy's crashing, traditional businesses are not doing well. And for example, if you look at our national leadership, President Trump uses either the language of blame or the language of we'll get back to normal, but there isn't a lot of what the next world might look like. There isn't a lot of we get to something that's resilient or something that's new. And I imagine, and by the way, even if you then look at our next show, the one that we're doing on Friday, which is on news, truth, and disinformation, is looking at kind of all of this disinformation that's going around, and we're basically being exploited because everybody's worried right now. So this bit of leadership that gets to getting things on the table that are acknowledge fundamental change, acknowledge we're going to have to give a lot of stuff up, and we get to something, I don't know if it's a promised land or it's better, that just strikes me as both an extraordinary thing and tough to look for. And I guess one of the questions I have is, there are so many young people and change makers and people who want to experiment and prototype and try new things that want to help out right now, but probably aren't part of big enterprises. I'm wondering how that ball of energy integrates in with institutional energy now more than ever.
Right. Well, just going to the first part of what you said, I think language does matter because, these are complex times. Times are always complex if you look closely enough. And so, what is the people don't absorb information; they absorb narratives. I mean, I think narratives are, structures which enable us to give facts salience and sense and meaning, and also create the symbols that we can use then to participate in collective narratives. Make sure that my narrative is the same as your narrative, and the thing about a crisis is it creates a narrative divergence, right? There's a possibility of saying, the only thing that matters is cash flow, or we're all going to die, or it's somebody else's fault, or actually it may not feel like it yet, but there's a huge opportunity here, or let's imagine ourselves in 10 years' time looking back on this and thinking about the tremendous opportunity to create a better version of to build back better, to have a better version of whatever we're talking about, a company or a society. I mean, these are all plausible narratives. Why are they all plausible? Because A, the reality we're talking about is complex enough to permit multiple interpretations. B, because your degree of optimism or pessimism is sort of a choice, and to some extent a self-fulfilling prophecy. And thirdly, because we have agency, because our narrative actions, the way that we communicate, have consequences. Assume doom, and thou shalt get doom.
Hey, Martin, I love this. I want to, we've got about maybe 20 minutes left. And one little bookmark in this, when we were talking, we talked about sort of superhuman leadership in some ways, and the rare times that a narrative kind of rallied an entire generation or rallied something. And you talked about the book Freedom's Forge, and we talked about how powerful stories are. Yes. And I guess I wonder, what are the stories you're hearing out there from leaders, if there are any, that really give you kind of hope in that regard? Or what synchronization are you starting to see, or ways that they're doing this?
Well, answering that question and also picking up Peter's, I suspect, a segue. How do young people engage in this? Well, logically, I've often wondered, what is the solution to the problem from hell of global warming? Global warming is the problem from hell because it happens very slowly. We don't pay, the next generation pays. We don't know exactly how it works. We probably have to change our lives to do something different. We have got good reasons for pessimism because a lot of things we tried didn't really work. And so as I've thought about that, one of the conclusions I've come to is that there is power in the observation that the next generation should logically care about this more than we do because they have more at stake. And maybe their indignation is a force. And one of the things I like to do is I like to transfer problems between domains. Ask the last people you'd expect to ask about a problem. So I actually asked my yoga teacher, what is the solution to global warming, and from a business perspective. And she thought about it and she said, well, I don't believe that business leaders really care as much as they say, and logically they wouldn't, but I think the next generation does, and essentially the big solution here is to listen to the next generation, and of course there's nothing that says that a 14-year-old can't be a leader. I find Greta Thunberg a very inspiring change agent. I think the voice of her indignation may have already shaped the global warming debate more than some august economic institutions and academics. So dare to be a leader would be one answer to your
dare to be a leader.
question, Peter.
And I'm wondering if the driving emotion is less indignation and more, oh my God, there's work to be done. There's excitement. We have to look at the world differently. I mean, but rather than us answer it, let's bring Elisa Heinrich in, who is going to join us now. We're not putting any burden on you, although you are the representation of your generation of the future of the world here. But that's just because we're three old white guys. But you're a recent graduate.
Wait, first let's make sure we can hear her. Lisa, can you say something? Make sure you're not on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. Can you tell us first just a little bit about yourself? Where'd you come from, and what the heck is Minerva and the class of 2020?
Yes, I'm Elisa. I'm from Asunción, Paraguay. Currently I'm studying applied mathematics, Minerva. So Minerva is actually a new university that just started some years ago. And it's trying to show an alternative of global education, bringing many concepts from actually research and learning. So all the model is oriented for the students, learning environment. So we have actually Minerva, we actually choose to have online classes for a long time. So the model is actually included with what we call the forum. That is a platform where we actually develop all the classes, and this allows us to also have flexibility. In every semester we are traveling around the world, and we have a semester in every country, and we try to orient our assignments and our studies into the reality of those communities and ideas. So yeah, that's a little bit about.
Yeah, and just for everyone's benefit, Minerva this is the second graduating class. I went to the very first one last June, so this is the second one. It's going to be digital next week, and the Minerva students are actually putting together the entire forum. They're choosing the speakers, they're deciding how to moderate it. So it's very much about them taking the action and inviting the Nobel laureate to talk, or inviting whatever, and putting them on the spot in some ways. And it kind of relates to Martin's comment about listen a little bit. The students seem to come from all over. I was blown away by the 160 incoming freshmen in the fall, every language, every nationality. But the thing is, after the first year of you went from Paraguay to, I think, the Tenderloin area, and in San Francisco, where you are all housed, and then you immediately took on a city challenge, focused on the community you were in as your capstone. So integrating with real people, online things. But then every semester after the first year, you moved to a different country and took on another thing. So this was wildly complicated. How did that affect you from your own identity standpoint? When you came from Paraguay as an engineer, thinking, I'm just going to leap.
Yes, actually, this is something that we were mentioning previously. I was actually studying engineering beforehand. I was in the engineering school in Paraguay, and I transferred to Minerva. And I think Minerva is really good to challenge every concept that you have about things. So I do think that when I came to Minerva, I was very naive, thinking that I was a very open-minded person. But I think I was very open-minded in a setting where everyone was very similar to me. Paraguay is a very homogeneous population, and everyone has very similar background, very similar cultural values, and same language. So coming to Minerva, where we are not just having a cultural shock in the city that we're learning how to live, but also with your classmates and people you're interacting, and even the professors are coming from all over the world. So it is a very interesting situation where I feel you learn how to challenge every aspect of your own identity and your assumptions and your bias. And I think it can be very confusing in the first years because you're kind of going through that process of reevaluating your own assumption and your own bias and your own perception about the world. But I think after some time, you start taking part of your identity that you completely agree with, and you start believing yourself and an identity that you build up after knowing like a lot more options, right? And I think that's a very interesting an aspect to take from Minerva. And then I think is also like the fact that you learn to be comfortable by being uncomfortable all the time. And I think that like very like changing environment of like every semester moving away and challenging your perception about many things allow you to be able to adapt very quickly in future in many different fields.
It's almost like you were building a little bit of practice, a little bit of muscle to kind of feel, okay, this is what it feels like. I remember this. And so you're not totally frozen by the fourth year. You're kind of like, okay, yeah, this is what happened. So it's almost like you were practicing being ready for a pretty complicated world. You know, we've talked about complexity in this show, and Martin was talking about listening to the next generation of leaders. He studies complexity and works with people like the Santa Fe Institute, we've cited a few times. But you were telling me that your actual capstone project was working with the Santa Fe Institute with these complexity scientists. What was that like? Tell me a little bit about what it was like to not only, you know, to the student journey, but also what was it like to grab a hold of thinking about complex systems, and what did you get excited about there, or the people you met, or the conversations?
Yeah, it's actually, I think Minerva kind of biased you because since the beginning you are getting exposed about what complex systems are. So Minerva kind of like give you that framework to see and understand the world as a what it is, a complex system. And I think that's very interesting because I think many of the problematics that we are seeing, for example, inequality, global warming, and like all these pandemics, all are examples, like again, like proof of like seeing the world as like what it is, a complex system. And so Minerva kind of exposed us like a lot of like the readings that we're doing in class, a lot of like the perspective that we're learning in classes are from like actually the Santa Fe Institute. And that's how I got a little bit of interested in that. And so I got the opportunity to work with them last summer, and I've been working with them with my capstone project, and I came back during the winter. And to be honest, it was an amazing experience. And it's like I plan to stay in academia and working with complex systems for the future. And I think it's a lot of what Martin was just describing and all this conversation. And I think like seeing, for example, the world as not just like a complicated system, but seeing like not just like the sum of many things, but actually an emergent property of like many parts that are like kind of working in a synergy, and understand how all those are interacting in a way and evolving and having like, you know, like a very different dynamic that we would expect if we see it in just like as a complicated system. So understanding the world as a complex system actually will help us to like, you know, step back and try to find simplicity in the complexity and find like patterns in like in that like complexity. Yeah. And I think that's basically what my capstone was doing. So I was working a lot on like the field what Jeffrey West started at the Institute and Louis Bettencourt about, you know, urban scaling theory. And so I think there's like a very interesting point about urban scaling theory, that is how income inequality start evolving to when cities start getting larger and larger. And there is many empirical studies actually nowadays, and it's something that I also replicate with like my team in the institute, like with my mentors and my collaborator, and how there is actually a deviation in the scaling. What does it mean? That like different sectors of the population actually behave very differently. So when city gets larger, we seem to see that like the rich people keep getting richer and richer, and the poor people getting poorer and poorer. And what something that is very known in like economics and as like the Matthew effect. And so like I was very interested about this thing because I saw so many economists talking about it, and it's a fact, right? And everyone knows that this is happening, but no one knows why, and there's not a lot of research on why exactly this is happening. And for me, I think it was very inspiring, like some ideas that Louis Bettencourt has. And he did a paper called "The Kind of Problem That City Is," and he talks that the issue with cities is that the mental model that we have about cities kind of constrain a lot our way to understand cities. And so he talks about how we need to see cities as like an agglomeration of social links. So seeing cities as networks. And I think that's fascinating, because then you can start understanding how cities, for example, I'm from Paraguay, and then I think in the global thought it's very common, like it's slums. And for me, it was always interesting how this happened. So if you start imagining cities as like a network structure, slums are like a cluster on your network that have a lot of connection between them, but they're not very connected with the rest of the city. And so like there's a lot of like, like information flow, opportunities, like wealth that doesn't flow in that part of the network. So like for me, my capstone project was like trying to understand how the topology of what kind of structure actually city has. Because it seems that like cities behave in a very different way from what we're expecting. We usually, when we talk about networks, and usually we talk about structure as like small world structures. And the small world structures are, for example, if you think about a group of people, everyone is connected, but not with everyone. So you are neighbors with some people, but with some people you're not connected. But like there's like a very small distance between the nodes. So you can connect with someone else through just one or two people. But when
Elisa, what you're describing here is a really interesting factor of networks, which is on the one hand, we're just a click away from someone else. On the other hand, we do cluster with who we know. Exactly. And because there's so little friction in network, it amplifies. So, networks of people with opportunity get tightly connected, and networks of people without opportunity stay disconnected. And when we look at this with the network theory, what we realize is, oh my God, one of the great paths to poverty and lack of opportunity is not connection, which literally means there's no mentor. There's no one showing you the way. My friend Nitzan Pellman started a company called Climb Higher, whose purpose was to connect kind of disadvantaged people up into companies for entry-level jobs, where in fact they'd have a network of people who they might talk to, right? So there's a interesting point here, which is and there's just a lot of research, right, that shows that these things, and this is part of the scaling issue, which is one of the problems with capitalism and companies today is the large do get larger. It might be interesting to bring Martin back in here. What we're describing here is this very interesting network scaling problem that we're in today. As business has less friction because we're more online and more global, what we're finding is the nature of capitalism has been less local, and therefore there's wealth concentration. And also with automation, fewer people have more of the capital. So we appear to be on kind of a runaway system of wealth inequality, which we know isn't good. And again, it's not like somebody got up and was deciding to be evil, but the architecture of where we've ended up seems to favor that. And so I guess one of the questions here is, as we're talking about leadership, what are the mechanisms we might imagine, given the nature of scaling economics, that can change this? Because on some level, we're talking about putting modifications into capitalism, which isn't easy, although I imagine we're going to have to do a lot of it soon. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how we might approach that. And then Elisa, on a practical.
I'm not sure what the question was there. Martin, did you get a question out of that somewhere?
Yes, I got a question, yeah.
Okay, good. I'm sorry.
So I think we're talking about governance. So one of the high level properties of a system that sort of shapes the behavioral system over time is governance. And so I think about this as, phenomena and regulatory loops. So business does what business does. It by pursuing self-interest and colliding self-interest, it creates, communal wealth, and there are side effects and concentration and externalities. So I tend to think about this in terms of not with the hand of God, how would we intervene and change the size profile of businesses, but rather what balancing or regulatory mechanism should we ensure are in place to make sure that we reinforce good things and discourage bad things. And so I guess I'd start off with, where do we have a complete absence of regulatory loops? So I think the reach of mankind has reached the level, and this is a new thing in history, I think, where we have collective planetary consequences for our actions. So our biggest problems are global, and we have no global government. We have institutions like the WEF and the United Nations and WHO, but I think they've all shown themselves to be, problematic and not quite up to the task of managing the complex problems we have. So I think that's one area for leadership and governance. Because right now, you can't even get to the starting line on global warming unless you can actually say, well, India, the US, China with divergent interests agree to, you need some sort of global governance principle. I think the next place I'd look is, in terms of what is the governance we need or deserve, is speed. The institutions we have are, almost deliberately slow. They're based on physical episodic voting processes and 3 and 4 year rotation cycles. And there is a good side to stability, but obviously there's a regulatory inadequacy too. How do we react to something as have the institutions that can move fast enough to do that? But we could. We have we have the technologies to do that if we wanted to. So probably there's governance innovation in terms of the.
It also feels. You're making me think of sort of the idea of autonomic governance mechanisms and other kinds of things. Right. I guess here it is, right. Algorithmic kinds of things. Certainly there's algorithmic takedown notices on YouTube, right, which disproportionately kind of values the legal process for the big company. But how do we have algorithms that are sort of for ourselves, almost, a Bletchley Park in our pocket that helps us actually have a level field? It relates to this, I think. You want to?
These problems apply at different levels. So the third thing I was going to say was that just at a company level, companies are faced with a new problem, which is that the popular meme is that timescales have contracted. Everything is moving faster, which is true. Not only are the processes that we had going faster, but we have now new things to think about. We need to think about the decisions that are made at algorithmic speed that we couldn't possibly influence directly, only indirectly. So we have the question of algorithmic governance. How do we check that the algorithms are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Especially hard since we don't have traceable AI. We don't really know what's going on in the
black box,
in the correlation algorithms that yielded the result. And but at the same time, slow changes are becoming more important too. So planetary shifts, social shifts, geopolitical shifts have begun to impinge on the present. So I just read a piece called Fractal Strategy, I think last week, where essentially I talk about the need for not management of 2 timescales. So companies typically do short-term planning, the operating plan, and they might do a 5-year strategic plan. But we need more timescales than that. We made an algorithmic timescale, a human timescale, a geopolitical timescale, and maybe others for particular purposes. And also, we can't just do them alternately. We need to think about all of those at the same time. And we don't really have many precedents in business to do that. But we do have biology. Biology, the evolutionary consequences of different commitments play out on different timescales. And so actually, if you look at some of the mechanisms that have evolved in biology, I do a lot of work with biologists to manage multiple timescales simultaneously. There are some very interesting hints. So one is the mechanism of progressive commitment. So let's take, for example, the getting cold. If I get cold, what I don't want to do is to undertake some deep genetic, expensive genetic strategy, which is going to, at great risk, make some huge irreversible change, which will turn out, not to be relevant because my kid's not the thermostat. It was just like a temporary blip. So instead, the first thing you do is you shiver. It's not particularly expensive. It's quite reversible, and if if things persist, you might put on a pullover. It's a little more expensive to put on a pullover, but it's quite reversible. Next thing you might do is move to a warmer country. little more expensive. You may damage your career and may need to rewire other aspects of your life. And eventually may make the wise choice that I made, which is to put on a little more fat. I've often got the timing wrong, but I did it preemptively, and which is reversible but physiologically expensive. And eventually you get to deep genetic changes. So imagine companies had progressive commitment mechanisms with increasing degrees of cost and irreversibility, and they thought about managing on multiple timescales that way. And this is just one of the ways in which biology manages these things. We can think about those sorts of things, and of course that is applicable to societies too. Like right now in COVID, there's some really fast stuff going on, which is, do you release this restriction or not? Do you open schools tomorrow or not? And there's some slower stuff going on, which is like, can we accelerate the vaccine or not? And there's some even slower stuff, which is, when do we reach herd immunity, and is the thing mutating, and how do we ensure incentives to develop these things in the future? And there are even longer time scale things like, do we have the regulatory systems to handle this if it happens next time? So actually these multi-time scale problems now seem to be almost a new and permanent feature of business and social systems. So maybe that's one thing that, I'm sure Minerva and Santa Fe and places like that are looking at. But in business, we don't yet have tools to do those things. So we're, inventing them on the fly.
I mean, Lisa, if you're studying with Jeffrey West, he's right there building general rules that equate physics and biology and cities. And I think the stunning thing about all of this is how just in time it is. Martin, you wrote this book a few years ago that talked about styles of leadership that you thought you were writing for a few esoteric people. Suddenly it's timely for that. System theory has been around, but if you look at the work of the Santa Fe Institute in the last month, they've put out 30 papers because suddenly it's its moment. And here you are graduating, really being steeped in this. So Elisa, kind of maybe you can connect up with us how some of these ideas that fly from biology and systems can apply to what you're going to have to go out and do next.
Yeah, I think it's actually so interesting because it's something that when the pandemic started. So I was actually in Taiwan when everything came up, and when the first case started, and I was just like, I know this is something that I should be very worried about, but I think this is going to be a boom for complexity science. And I was very excited actually about that because it is just it's exactly what we were talking about, all these issues that we're seeing, like the pandemic, global warming, inequality, and how to see in different levels, they are all coming together with complexity science. And I think the beauty about complexity science is that there is completely a disciplinary, there is no limit about what kind of science you're using. If you're using economists and physicists and biology is in the same room. And I think it comes in a completely different setting from a competitive but more collaborative world, in which we need the views from different fields in order to have a more holistic actually a more holistic approach of the issue, and in different levels of analysis, as we were mentioning before. So yeah, so I think that's even right now, I think, for example, in my capstone, when I was working on the idea of looking at cities and seeing how cities in the small scales, little towns, they have a completely different structure of social networks than when they scale up to large cities. And that's actually something that I was thinking when I was reading a paper from biological systems, because in many biology networks, you observe what is called the small world fractal dichotomy. That is there some system in nature that start having a kind of a fractal structure, but then when they get larger and larger, they become a small world, a completely different type of structure. So I was like, oh, this seems that it happening in cities, but the other way around. So I think how you can take so many ideas from different disciplines, and also how you can implement models from completely different disparate science and fields into a way to tackle issues that is affecting all over the world.
Lisa, if we talk about these ideas, we can almost connect them up with things that we've seen over the last couple of weeks here on Quarantine. Last week we talked about self-adapting supply chains. we talked about algorithmic governance at one point, and so there are all of these changes that keep going on. Mick, I think you dropped off and you're back.
I did, yeah. We should probably mention that we're past 5 o'clock Pacific time. And if anyone needs to go, let's make sure that they can leave. I know that it gets late everywhere. We will keep going in case either one of you wants to stay, because we tend to have viewers that just keep watching and we do things. So Elisa, you mentioned Raj Chetty's work from Harvard, and how just moving people a few blocks from one slum area to maybe a different neighborhood, not changing anything else, moving them a few blocks so that they just interacted with different people, radically changed their economic outcomes, a decade later. Do you think anything's happening here with the sort of the Zoom kind of being like moving people a few blocks in some ways during the crisis? Do you think there's a sort of virtual version of this happening? What are you seeing with your friends and family and things like that?
Yeah, I think actually this is very interesting, and I think it will depend a lot of what context we are looking at. It would depend a lot on which system we are looking at. If we're seeing people living in I don't know, they have access to, for example, computers, and they have access to internet, of course. But I think it is beneficial for a sector of the population. I have experience of many friends who are telling me how, for example, now so many conferences are moving into virtual settings, and so many other type of meetings. Even this conversation that we are having right now is because we realize how we can actually take more advantage of the online platforms that we have in hand. That I think before the pandemics, we were not very actually taking full advantage of all this. And I think this is a lot to do with what Martin also was mentioning, how there's a completely change of the settings because of we think that things gonna go back to normal, things gonna go back exactly how they were before, and they're not. There's gonna be a boom of people trying to see how they're gonna adapt better into platforms, and also because they already have some contact with that, they already got exposure to it. It will allow them to later on to implement those much more easily in their daily lives. So I think it is connecting, and is exactly what I was talking before. That in cities we see that we change from a small word to a fractal, but that now I think with the access of technology, we are kind of breaking apart a lot of structural cutout, for example, geographical constraint that we have with the access in cities, and we are allowing people to get connected. And even if we keep breaking this short link to long edges, let's say, if we start thinking in network again, we can even start becoming a small world again in a much larger scale. I think that's really interesting.
So I want to make sure, wait one sec. Hey, Martin, I don't know if you have to leave or not. If you do, I wanted to see if you had any last thoughts or a question for Elisa. And if you're okay staying a little longer, we'll probably keep going for a little bit.
I do have to jump on to a book call, actually, but I guess I like to always end on an optimistic note. So I think today's conversation has been quite balanced between problems and opportunities, but I think it's an opportunity for ideas. I've never seen a greater receptivity to ideas than ever before. I think we have this temporary unfreezing of institutional behaviors and habits and leadership theory. So it's a time when it's one of those sort of bursts of history where a lot of things happen quickly. History is very shapeable right now. I think I think we have this sort of wartime communal spirit. I think the collective interest is probably never more susceptible to being addressed than right now. And Elisa's discipline is discipline of the day. We need more system theorists, and because you're being minted as a system theorist at precisely the right time to change the world, I think. So thanks very much for the privilege of participating in this conversation.
Martin, thank you so much for these ideas. And it strikes me we have an opportunity to take the social mobility that Lisa suggests and connect it up to these networks that we're in right now in real time as people are at home and looking at things, and we can probably make some progress. And we're going to get back to you, and love to collaborate on that.
Indeed. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks. Hey, Mickey.
Actually,
and
before we go past that, I just wanted to react to something Martin said. With I just love, I think Elisa, it took me till I was at least 30, I think, and already had like moved and changed my idea of what my job would be once or twice before I even really understood what complexity was a little bit. I was a happy industrial designer. I could make things. I could make them kind of sexy looking or cool looking. I could get them to be down in a price point that would work. I could make fancy places, but I didn't understand much of what was going on in our heads or what was going on like at a world level. And I think this has always shocked and surprised me about Minerva, but particularly you. I mean, just listening to you, rattling off the fractal versus this and the this and this. I love this. I think this gives me a lot of hope for the future. And I think leadership, as Martin points out in his new book, starts with sort of personal leadership. How do you lead your mind to be a little more optimistic? How do you change your mindset? How do you do things? And it feels like you're right on the right path for this. So I'm just, I feel hope, which is good.
Thank you so much.
I want to propose
go ahead.
An empirical experiment and an intervention. So here we understand that opportunity is connected in network theory to who you're connected up with. And here we are online right now having this great conversation. And I bet we keep getting the same people because we keep inviting the same people. And it's not just us, right? TED gets the same people. The Long Now gets the same people. DLD, World Economic Forum. I could go on and on with every global innovation network. And if we were to apply network analysis just to like who tuned in the email list, I bet we'd see some tight clustering of the same people. But as Elisa points out, that's completely ridiculous in this frictionless world. I mean, if there was ever a moment to have your friends back at home in Paraguay and, people just south of Market here in San Francisco who aren't part of this conversation and literally connecting them up in cohorts to talk about this stuff, that just seems like the thing to be done because, frankly, like all the smart people in the world, all they're doing is sitting around talking to each other right now. So what a great chance to invite people in. So my question is, how do we design that experiment, measure it, and get on with this?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I think it's so true what you're saying, because I think right now and I'm saying hi to all my friends from Paraguay who are looking at me right now. And I think it's going to be very interesting because just as you mentioned before, I don't think this like the audience that you were having before. And I think it's going to be interesting that now these people are going to be exposure like to your program and your ideas. And I think this is the way that we should be going around. And I think like going back to like what we were talking before about like networks and ideas and like this is exactly the reason why Jeffrey West was saying that cities were great. Because
exactly.
Because the idea was that like cities was a great way to condense and like densify people in a place, so like people were interacting and talking, and people that before will not have contact between each other, they start having contact between each other. But
so
now,
wait, real quick, you say Jeffrey a few times, but there might be people who tuned in who have no idea who you're talking about. I realize my entire studio is based on sitting on Jeffrey's book, so I have to pull his book out. We're talking about scale, which actually illustrates that cities are not the same as organisms or organizations. There are innate scaling laws and theories. And that's part of what Elisa has been working with Betancourt and others on kind of how do we actually find the intrinsicness of this. It's exactly what he was saying about cities. I'm really fascinated about, how will the blurring between the physical city and the virtual city, will it change his theories? Will it actually exploit a theory? Could we exploit a theory? There's no way for Zoom to allow you to wander down the street of Zoom, but what if it could? Or, just hang out in the backyard with a group or whatever, but what if it could? And what if, or someone else, and I'm not going to use Zoom as an example all the time, but Elisa, how would you build this experiment though? How could we do this experiment with our actual viewers and the people who then look at the podcasts that come out of this or the other things?
Yeah, I think it's actually very interesting because that's also a question that I was having when I was studying all this. It's like, because there's, for example, a study that actually the MIT Media Lab, and the person who came last week, I think, was from MIT Media Lab too. But like, I know the MIT Media Lab and the Santa Fe Institute work in this paper, taking like cities from Portugal, and they were like, so like it was very interesting what they were doing. So basically, their idea was to check the geolocation of the calls and see who were talking with who in the cities. And they wanted to see how like this interaction changed in different cities, right, and different city sizes. And I think it was very interesting, the conclusion that they got, because one of the conclusions that they got is like the clustering that you observe doesn't change when city get bigger. And I think that's fascinating, because that kind of gives the idea of like the Dunbar number. And like for people that don't know what the Dunbar number is basically the idea that we have some kind of cognitive limitation about how many people we can actually be connected to. So like, even if we have access to all the city, there's no, like, it's really hard for you to be connected with all the city, you know? But I think
I feel like, wait a second, I just want to stop here. We're at episode 16, and we finally had somebody cite the Dunbar number. I think that's good. Robin Dunbar and some of the work around sort of primate. Why did our brain grow differently? Why are bonobos the closest ones to humans? Why are they xenophilic? They actually like strangers. And why are humans that way? And then how it's almost like a little bit of the Kevin Bacon theory meets something. How many people can we really keep in touch with? Oh, Lisa, you're killing me. Just great ideas and thoughts.
No, and I think this is fascinating, because you start realizing how many different fields had to be involved in order to actually understand different systems. So like, just I'm mentioning, I'm not an expert on anything really, but I think it's very interesting to like, you know, to like try to understand cities. We need sociologists, we need architecture, like architects, we need like mathematicians, we need economists, we need people from all fields to like bring up these ideas exactly. And I think that's why the Santa Fe Institute is great, because it's a great platform to like meet and like exchange ideas. And I think this is exactly the reason why we care so much about segregation, is because when like cities start being segregated is where like our cities decrease in size in like virtually, because the number of people that you are interacting is going to be smaller if like you are segregating a neighborhood, which that means that there is no exchange of idea from different parts of the cities. So there is no all these scaling ideas that we were saying, that because so like basically the way that Jeffrey and Luis and we're talking about cities, that they see it as a social reactor, that like kind of like, because we are in contact like constantly, is that many ideas are being produced. So like, I think this is exactly like very interesting about this type of platforms and like Zoom and everything, is that we are allowing people from different sectors, even with all these limitations that we have.
Well, Lisa, by the way, I just want to point out that your friends from Paraguay have actually been saying hi on YouTube. There's Benjamin, Franklin Science Corner, and others. And that's, I think, a little bit what you mean. You know, a great outcome from another friend, and we've got different people saying hi. I think a great outcome from this moment in time, is to say, your point was sort of inter and anti-disciplinarians, people who really deeply work across and between these places, because complex systems are not made up of just one thing, not just the tech people who rule the world, or not just the whatever. And it also is this opportunity to say, how might people co-create together? Because there's one thing to kind of have a Zoom call together. That's okay. But how can we co-create together? In other words, what if we were to do an episode where you invited so many people that you wanted to invite, and Peter invited some, and Martin invited some, and we picked somebody off the street and said invite some, and we did the whole episode with the whiteboard, and everyone took over a section and tried to actually work together on something, because that way you'd learn about the other person by creating together. And I'm a big proponent of making together, even if it's dinner, even if it's not, something simple. It changes the dynamic. Elisa, what do you think about all the rest of your class? Like, what are you excited about in terms of class of 2020, and this generation? What are some things that get you get you fired up?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that actually I think is, we were talking a lot before about the idea that different, I don't know, like this generation, I think we're like coming with like a kind of like a different front, and very different from like previous generation, in which like, I don't know, my Minerva class, I think it was very interesting because we went through so many cities and we saw so many like very social complex issues when we were in the US with like all the Trump election happening. And then like we went to Korea and there was like the missile crisis between North Korea and the US. So like so many of my classmates, I think, were like living day by day with like a flight ticket back home in case that things comes up very. And like when we went to Argentina, we got to see a lot of about like the economic crisis that was happening there, and like so on. And like when we were in Taiwan, all our class had to be evacuated from Taiwan because of the coronavirus situation. So we had to live in a range of like a week.
So you've been right in the middle of this, and you know, I think there's this this notion of sort of, well, you know, the grass is greener on the other side, they say. You know, oh, someone over there can do something, we can't. But you were able to actually see that everywhere you went, people are people, cities are cities, crisis is crisis, and you either act or you get afraid. Or you go back and forth. I mean, I feel a lot of self-doubt and fear. So it feels like this is just part of it, and at least you're getting sensitized to it.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because there's actually a very like a conversation that I think everyone has a lot, in which
Lisa,
that like, yeah, sorry.
Two things. One, on this experiment, I want to push that a little bit further, but I also
Peter's determined. He wants to do some.
We're going to do it.
We're turning this show into a lab. But before that, I wanted to illustrate the point that you were making, which is, you know, we all exist in networks and we can visualize them but we stop and do that, and that will tell us social mobility. So let's just take a look at the video I just sent you. This is some work that the MIT Sensible City Lab did around 2010. And what they did is they took all of the cell phone connections.
Yeah. This is the study I was mentioning before, yeah.
In UK. So this is who calls who. Well, who calls who? And you can narrate this, but basically it creates the implicit network. And what you find is, you know, there's a tight ball in London and more remote areas are less connected. So go ahead and tell us kind of, as you looked at this study, what you learned and kind of what this tells us about wealth and social mobility.
Yeah, I think like there's like two main conclusions of this paper. One of them was that like, the clustering is the same. It doesn't matter the size of the city, you're going to see the same amount of clustering. That was like the idea with Mikey we were talking about, like the Dunbar number, right?
Yeah.
And I think the second conclusion, and I think is very interesting, is that we see more interaction in cities. So people are more in contact. They're calling each other more often when you are in cities. So this is the reason why, if you just like think about physics and how, like, for example, if you increment the heat in like particles, they start moving much more faster. I think it's something similar to what is happening in cities. It's like there's like how like there's like much more density. Like there's like more people in a very small like number, like geographic location. So there is like much more likely that you're gonna be interacting with someone else.
The random collisions.
Exactly. And like this is great for like ideas, but this is actually the reason why the pandemics are happening so much drastically than before.
That's right.
Because we are interacting like constantly.
We can't help ourselves. Yeah.
Exactly.
I feel like that's kind of a part of this. I feel like, by the way, a person I want to get in here in a future episode would be Tamash, who worked with Robin on a number of the papers, and who has been exploring some new math about kind of primate meets human potential here, just because it seems to relate. I don't think we're going to leave cities behind. I mean, I'm a big fan of cities, but I also think we're just going to have to be clever and creative. There could be all sorts of new products out there. You know, I've seen the nice social distancing hats and hoop skirts that look kind of like from the Edwardian period and thing. I think that would be fun. I'd like
Which brings us back to our experiment.
To wander around.
So apropos to that, so look, one thing we could do, the first state is we could just do what we're doing now, which is like we reach our people. As we figured out a moment ago, we want to replicate these collisions and this broadening of the network and opportunity network, both because we want to grow an audience, but the ideas that we and all these other folks are having need to be shared with a broader group of people. So we want to do that.
Reactor, because you said city is a social reactor. It'd be interesting to think about what does that mean in the time of COVID.
More neutrons bouncing against each other and creating greater heat. Okay, but then the next thing is, look, this show is mostly broadcast. We're talking, and there's some comments. But
That's
what we're
way.
really interested in is giving people something to do to bring about change. Because if you're hopeless when you think nothing good's going to happen. But if lots of people are collaborating on projects, this is why people like Burning Man. They're doing something. This is why Habitat for Humanity is great. People come together and build something. Right now, there's a lot to be built. So my question is, if we organize lots of people, and we're aware of the tasks. There's distributed energy tasks. There's food tasks. There's how do we put art in our cities. There's how is the city you're coming from going to learn from people. How do we turn this from a connection and a conversation into a series of experiments that happen, rapidly over the next year? I mean, think about this summer. You've got an awful lot of kids are going to be at home. Students are going to be at home. Summer camp's going to have to be at home right through the school year. So we have the best opportunity to connect people up and produce change. And so you just went to school about this. How might we turn this show into a World's Fair or a lab of making tomorrow?
I think like all what you were saying, I think it's just give me like the idea that how all these platforms, like how the online platform can be actually a great opportunity to break this cluster in our network and create more like long distance links between people that are not usually connected. So I think like, for example, this idea that you were mentioning, like bringing me here, who is like, I'm like a person completely, I think, exterior of like your normal network. It just bringing like an audience from a completely different place too. So I think it is going to be interesting for you, and you actually can do a lot of analysis that, because I think now you have like a point in which like you're going to have like a time lapse of like people that were in your network and inviting people from your network. And now from now on, if you start inviting people who are outside your network, and like how, for example, you can do like an analysis of
how does it metastasize? Where does it go? Hey, Omid, can you pull up the whiteboard for a second? This is kind of every episode. It's all one big whiteboard. Everybody who's watching can jump on there and add their Post-its to it right now. It's open and public. But this goes all the way back to the very first episode. So we've got both kind of thoughts, references, books that people are recommending. If we were to zoom into some of those, we'd see different things. But what we haven't done yet is we haven't actually stepped back and said, this comment that Elisa made, that relates to this, and almost build out an information architecture or a network diagram or a system model. But the other thing would be to look for where are the gaps. Like, where are we just missing the conversation? Because frankly, this is just an all volunteer army. We're just having fun, but it's been some delightful conversations. I think I could find scale probably in here, like just 2 books back or 2 episodes back if we look, because it came up recently in one of the conversations. So even that notion that you're saying, that we've got a lot of data actually in some way. I know, Peter, you're planning on transcribing this stuff or having it be little podcast segments as well and other elements. But the thing I worry about with this, though, Peter, I would say, I think there are unplanned experiments and planned experiments. If you remember a few episodes back, we talked about Andreas Weigand, who is the head scientist for Amazon, said that we are in the most huge unplanned experiment ever. And then Ting Jiang from Duke Center for Advanced Hindsight said, yeah, but you know what? We could do intentional experiments. Experiments are sometimes used to just talk about, I'm going to try something, ad hoc. And it's the madness or the wisdom of the crowds. Good luck. But an intentional experiment, where we took a little more time and acted the way that maybe Elisa thinks now that she's a researcher. She's going on to Stanford next, I think. And she's going to continue this as a researcher thinking about this stuff. putting a little intentionality into it now means we might track things slightly different because we have a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And we want to actually try to find out an answer to something. And I think right now, the best we could do is probably a unintentional experiment or, just an accidental experiment. Elisa, what's your reaction to that? I mean, do you agree, disagree, thoughts?
I mean, I think it's true. Like, and I think that's all what the process of like doing research it is, at least for me. I'm not like a very experienced. I just started basically my career, but I think it's like for me. I think when I started like doing my capstone with SFI, I spent 2 months just reading, and I remember I was telling my mentor, I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm not doing anything because I see all these people already having like beautiful plots about the results, and I was just still like trying to understand like what was the scaling theory all about.
But that's kind of the joy, I guess, too,
exactly,
right? Like,
it's beautiful.
I would love people to celebrate reading.
Yeah, it is beautiful, and I think it's because it kind of like go very slow, but once it kind of like, in physics, that when you're pushing one object, there's like one point in which like it actually start moving.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of like getting a lot of knowledge about things and reading a lot of things, it may feel frustrating sometimes, but at some point there's a click, that's when like things start happening. And I think like for me, it was kind of like a very changing experiment all the time, because I was like, oh, like I finished all these books and I have this idea what is happening. But then, for example, I was like reading a paper from a completely different field in biology, and I was like, wait a minute, this can be relevant from like what I was looking before. So it's just like, I think it's also kind of like being able to adapt and like see experiments.
Well, you're also kind of primed that you built up a body of knowledge and connections through the reading process.
Yeah.
So you've gone off of the shallows, right? Read the quick little thing, and you've gone down into the deep.
Yes.
And now that you've done that, you've kind of primed yourself that adding another piece of information is actually kind of more trivial. You can just pick that book up and go, oh yeah, this relates to this way, and this researcher here. And I think they totally never read that research paper, or these guys are characterizing this experiment wrong. So that's kind of the joy of research.
By
Peter,
the way,
you look like you've got a question.
If we might say something about potential energy and the interface between unintentional and intentional experiments. Okay, so 2 months ago, nobody knew we were going to tell everybody to stop the world, go home, and get on Zoom and talk to your same circle of friends all day long. But that's what we did. And we did it with the better part of several billion people, which is ridiculous. So you kind of have to assume at this point, there's an entire planet of people who are getting itchy about talking to the same people and realize we need to make a better world or we're really screwed. So that's a lot of potential energy. And the whole lot of us are going from a very unintentional experiment called go home to what's next. And, the default version of what's next is what we see in the news every day. Go outside, go take your mask off and yell at the guy who told you to put the mask on, which is, that's going to go on. Or it's literally taking this thinking and connecting these communities up. The Burning Man community friends who are on here, Delucia, who's in Singapore, on here. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people around the world that are like, what would it be like to prototype and suggest and put this collective hive to work? And this is something that you and I and Kevin Kelly have talked about on this, which is we know that the great resource in the world is what does it mean to put a whole bunch of people on a project and work together and move ourselves forward? And we don't quite know the tools for that. We're looking at virtual reality tools and stuff in Unity. And
I think the other thing that's happening is people are, because they've had to use these tools. Yeah. They've fast become experts at how the tool was not designed for them, how the tool was designed for like this half-baked idea of a bad meeting from the 1990s, and sitting around the table staring at each other's face, which isn't the way anybody actually collaborates in the real world, at all. They draw on whiteboards together. They like go for walks and talk about things. They, conversations evolve new languages as they kind of go. We call this place the Watergate Hotel, but then pretty soon that Watergate becomes this thing for a scandal, and then pretty soon we're saying Obamagate or Trumpgate or whatever. Like, things evolve over time, and these platforms seem kind of limited. But what I love about it is everybody probably has a strong assertion about how it could be better.
And here's
so the interesting thing was, how do we do it? Yeah,
we're going to convene 2 weeks from today here.
Really?
Yes, we're going to send everybody home. We're going to
I'm going to sleep for a while though, Peter, and I want to make sure that we convene without me or you, because I'm just bored of you now.
Exactly.
I feel like we've been
And I've invented a solution to that.
I'm like a house guest that never left. I'm just sitting on your couch all the time.
Yeah. So here's what I'd love to suggest, which is this problem of how do people actually collaborate and build something big and global? Like a lot of people are working on this. Like I was talking to James Hanusa today, who's working on stuff with Burning Man in this arena, and Chris Breedlove from Burning Man. I was talking to him, and then we've got Delucia in Singapore who's working on it, and Jen Sander has been thinking about this stuff for years. Kind of Erica Blair and the Immersiverse people. Everybody's sitting around thinking about how do we connect people up and do something globally.
Okay, but you just mentioned a whole bunch of people that Elisa's like, who are those people? Come on. Like, we got to get the real people involved in this thing. So she's got different ideas, and I'd like to see this come together.
And let's give ourselves 2 weeks and stop bringing it together on the show here. That's my point. We'll go figure it out offline. But no, really, we got to do this.
All right, if anyone's watching still in our overtime segment, help.
Yeah. we have work to do here.
Yeah.
Which, look, practically speaking, what I'm really saying is we should do, look, we did a couple of shows on how the online and Zoom room was reacting to parties and nightlife and pushing it, right? And so that was around the entertainment side. And, and we've talked about like business tools, but we're now talking about connecting people up to prototype, to imagine. It's something between Burning Man and a World's Fair and urban prototyping to go create the kind of, we ought to do a show on that. So we'll refine it more.
All right.
All right.
I like it. Elisa, thank you so much for coming. I know we just put you on the spot at the last minute.
No, don't worry.
Thank you
for inviting me and giving me some space here. I really appreciate it.
All right. I want to hear comments from you, though, offline about who you think we should have next. So we need suggestions.
I mean, we can keep thinking, but always, I think you brought me here talking about complexity, but I think there's a lot of complexity people at SFI that can be in talk actually more.
Yes.
We haven't had anybody from SFI yet. Okay. We're just fans, I think.
I actually was looking at your episode. I was like, why they're not inviting people from SFI yet? So
we're slow. It's about our own network. I don't know anybody there.
Do you know anyone there you can hook us up with?
Yes, I can actually connect you with some people there.
This is great.
Anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much for coming, Elisa. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Martin.
And now let's plug the next show.
What's the next show?
Okay, as positive as this has been, next time we're going to take the deep dive into news, truth, and propaganda in the age of COVID. You may have noticed that there has been lots of disinformation on your Facebook feed. There are people pushing weird conspiracy theories all over the place. And what's going on here? And is this actually connected to the same bit of mind hacking that went on in the 2016 elections, where Facebook and its algorithms were used to amplify disinformation? That's something we want to get into next time in News, Truth, and Propaganda. And boy, do we have great people joining us.
When is next time? It's going to be Friday, right? Just
this Friday at 4 p.m. So what is that, 48 hours from now?
Pacific time.
48 hours Pacific was actually, it's probably 46 hours from now, but at 4 p.m. Pacific time on Friday. And we have 3 guests. We have Yael Eisenstadt, who was National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. She was a CIA agent, and then she went off to Facebook to run election security until she resigned and became a public critic about how social media platforms might be destroying civil discourse. And if you think about it, in COVID, there has been a flare-up again in that same mind virus, in the idea that we're being hacked by ideas that divide us. So we're going to get into that and see how, is this the Russians again? Is this are these like anti-vaxxer groups? Is it organic? So we're going to get into what are the mechanisms that are messing with us, who's doing it, and what's the effect of that. We're also going to take a look at more broadly the role of news in all this. And we're going to have on Craig Foreman. Craig runs McClatchy. It is the largest chain of newspapers in the nation: the Miami Herald, the Kansas City Star, the Modesto Bee, the Sacramento Bee. This has been local news is more important than ever. And it is under siege. It was already under siege because newspapers were losing out to everything else. But imagine what happens when the advertisers go away and all the local merchants aren't there. So it's important and it's difficult. The other cool thing about Craig is Craig used to be a senior executive at Yahoo. So he helped build the digital environment, which is now challenging his newspapers, and is the environment that Yael is very worried about over at, in terms of what's happening to platforms and Facebook. And our third guest, just because it's going to be such a great show, is Lisa Napoli, whose book, Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24 Hours News just came out yesterday. Lisa's a dear friend, a former New York Times and an MSNBC and NPR reporter, but her book is about the birth of this 24-hour news environment, the news junkie environment. In a way, it's the chaos butterfly event that brought us to the news world today, because when CNN started, it was destined to fail. It was just a ridiculous idea of Ted Turner's, who, by the way, had the idea because he thought news was too liberal and he wanted to put a more conservative voice into the whole thing. That effect that started has now become central to how we became news junkies, to the change of the news environment, and to whether we're being hacked. That's what we're going to talk about Friday. And one other feature we're introducing here on Quarantine are reading and discussion lists. We will put these up on our site at quarantine.today, but we prepared kind of a deep set of background readings that we're using to produce the show on how we've been hacked, going back to KGB people in the 1980s, whose techniques are being used today, and on up to what is going on in disinformation now. So we're going to put the reading list up. We also have one for today with a lot of Martin's work and Santa Fe Institute works. And going back to the last show, we have one on cities. So as we start to move this show from a show into a global network for action, or whatever we were talking about earlier today, we'll get those things up. Mick, anything else you want to add before we let everybody go have dinner or whatever comes next?
Well, nothing at all other than let's keep sharing reading lists. I think a Quarantine Book Club is always good. And you're going to want to tune in on Friday. I worked for about 4 or 5 months with Yael as a fellow at Autodesk in the office of the CTO. So she came out to Silicon Valley just to understand, was there any Silicon Valley company that wasn't an irresponsible company that had effectively a weapon of mass distraction? And so challenged all the way up through our CEO to have a public conversation with all of our employees at Autodesk, and it changed the company. It helped them really think deeply about how we can be ethical and responsible and not throw away the technologies, but how can we actually watch out for sort of things that kind of are second order effects and lurking. And so I'm super looking forward to this Friday. If you get a chance, go to our reading list and watch the 7-minute video that Yael sent us from the 1980s, where a KGB defector explains the 4 ways to undermine a country or an enemy. And then think about that for Friday, especially all those that are using Facebook to stream this. Thanks.
By the way, the reading list, Omid will be putting it up. He asked me to announce it after the show. So it'll be at quarantine.today, at www.quarantine.today. It'll be up there pretty soon. Meanwhile, it is now 5:47 Pacific Quarantine. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on Friday.
Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.